Imagine going on a simple shopping trip, only for it to turn into a nightmare. An elderly black man, Elijah, is viciously attacked in a grocery store for refusing to give up his place in line. But there's more to the story. Elijah's son is a local police captain, and he's determined to bring justice. Watch until the end to see how this story unfolds, and trust me, you won't believe the outcome. Don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories like this. Elijah Thompson, a 70-year-old black man, adjusted his hat as he made his way through the bustling grocery store. The fluorescent lights were harsh on his aging eyes, and the constant noise of beeping scanners and chattering shoppers filled the air around him. Today wasn't just an ordinary shopping trip. He was here for a special purpose. His son, Derek, the proud captain of the local police force, was hosting a birthday dinner to celebrate the occasion. Elijah had promised to bring some of Derek's favorite dishes, so he'd spent the day gathering all the ingredients and making sure everything was perfect. As Elijah waited patiently in line, he thought about the years that had passed and how proud he was of the man his son had become. Derek had always been driven, committed to justice, and determined to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Elijah often felt a surge of pride knowing that Derek was respected in the community, a symbol of strength and fairness. But he knew that, in many ways, Derek's role came with a heavy burden. With a gentle sigh, Elijah glanced at the items in his cart and adjusted his stance, shifting his weight from one tired leg to the other. The line moved slowly, but he didn't mind. He was a patient man, a trait he had acquired over a lifetime of challenges. At his age, he had learned the art of waiting and was content to take life as it came. But today, in the back of his mind, he felt a bit of urgency. He didn't want to be late for his son's celebration. Suddenly, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "Hey, old man, move it." The voice was sharp, impatient, and filled with a distinct edge of contempt. Elijah turned, startled, and saw a young man standing behind him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and heavily tattooed, with an expression that dripped with arrogance. Elijah looked at the young man, slightly taken aback. He had experienced disrespect in his life, but there was something different about the hostility in this young man's eyes. Elijah remained calm and offered a polite nod. "I'll be done shortly, young man," he replied gently, turning back to the cashier. But the man wasn't satisfied. "I said, move it," he demanded, his tone rising with irritation. "I don't have time to wait behind people like you." Elijah blinked, feeling a familiar chill settle over him. He had endured racism throughout his life, but it was rare for it to be so openly displayed in a place like this. For a moment, he considered stepping aside. After all, he was a man who preferred to avoid conflict. But then he remembered the importance of the evening and the promise he'd made to Derek. Steeling himself, he turned back to the cashier, resolved to finish his purchase without yielding to the young man's aggression. "No," Elijah said firmly, though his voice remained calm. "I'm almost done. You'll have to wait your turn." The young man's expression twisted with disbelief and anger. His fists clenched at his sides, and a dark, menacing look settled on his face as he stepped closer to Elijah, towering over him. "What did you just say to me?" he growled, his tone dangerously low. Elijah's heart began to beat faster, but he held his ground. "I said you'll have to wait," he repeated, his voice steady. "That's how lines work." The young man let out a mocking laugh, the sound filled with bitterness and scorn. "You think you can tell me what to do?" he sneered. "You don't get to tell me anything, not someone like you." The venom in his words was unmistakable. a subtle but stinging reminder of the prejudice that Elijah had faced countless times before. For a moment, the memories of past indignities washed over him, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Please," Elijah said quietly, hoping to diffuse the situation, "there's no need to make a scene." But his calmness only seemed to inflame the man further. With a sudden, violent motion, the young man shoved Elijah hard in the chest. The force of the blow took him by surprise, and before he could react, he stumbled backward, losing his balance and falling to the ground. His head struck the cold, hard floor, and a wave of dizziness swept over him as pain shot through his body. The young man's sneer deepened as he looked down at Elijah. "Stay down, old man," he spat, his voice laced with hatred. As Elijah lay there, dazed and disoriented, he felt a sharp, jarring pain as the young man kicked him in the side. Once, twice. Each blow sent shockwaves through his body, and he struggled to catch his breath. Around them, other shoppers gasped and murmured, some fumbling with their phones to record the incident, but no one stepped forward to help. The atmosphere had shifted, and it seemed as though time itself had slowed, trapping everyone in a surreal moment of disbelief. "You people never know when to keep your place," the young man sneered, his words hanging in the air like a dark cloud. Through the haze of pain and humiliation, Elijah managed to lift his head slightly. He opened his mouth to speak, to protest, but the words caught in his throat. His body felt weak, his strength sapped by the violence he had just endured. He could barely move, and the faces of the onlookers blurred as he struggled to stay conscious. In the distance, Elijah heard the faint sound of approaching sirens, the telltale sign that the store's management had called for help. But instead of relief, a sense of dread settled over him. He knew that, too often, the arrival of the police did not bring justice for people like him. The sight of him, a black man lying injured on the floor, might be all they needed to assume the worst. As the sirens grew louder, Elijah closed his eyes, bracing himself for what was to come. The police arrived swiftly, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow through the store windows. The crowd parted as two officers entered, scanning the scene. Their eyes landed on Elijah, still on the ground, and then shifted to the young man who had stepped back, raising his hands in a show of mock innocence. "Thank God you're here, officers," he said, his voice dripping with false relief. "This man attacked me. I was just defending myself." The officers looked down at Elijah, their expressions unreadable as they took in the scene. Elijah, an elderly black man lying bruised on the floor, and the young white man standing over him with his hands raised. It was an image that seemed to tell a story, but not the true one. One of the officers, a tall, burly man with a hard-set jaw, stepped forward and looked down at Elijah. His voice was flat, almost disinterested. "Is that right?" he asked, though it was clear he wasn't looking for an answer from Elijah. The young man nodded, maintaining his facade. "I don't know what set him off," he said, feigning innocence. "He just started yelling and then tried to hit me. I had to push him away." Elijah struggled to speak, to explain what had really happened, but his voice was weak, his words barely audible. I didn't." The shorter officer moved toward Elijah, his expression hardening. "Get up," he ordered sharply, his tone leaving no room for protest. Elijah tried to push himself up, his body aching from the attack, but he couldn't move fast enough. Frustrated, the officer grabbed Elijah's arm roughly and yanked him to his feet, ignoring the groan of pain that escaped his lips. "I didn't do anything," Elijah managed to say, his voice weak but steady. He attacked me. Save it." the officer muttered under his breath, dismissing Elijah's words without a second thought. "We'll sort this out at the station." The taller officer approached the young man and patted him on the shoulder. "You'll be all right," he said reassuringly. "We just need to take a statement from you." As they led Elijah toward the exit, the shorter officer gave him a rough shove, causing him to stumble. His legs were shaky, his body still weak from the attack, and the rough handling only made the pain worse. Behind them, the other shoppers remained silent, watching in shock but unwilling to intervene. As the officers escorted him out of the store and into the back seat of the police car, Elijah felt a profound sense of helplessness. His body ached, his dignity was shattered, and he knew that no one had listened to his side of the story. As the police car pulled away from the store, the cold metal of the handcuffs bit into his wrists, and the world around him seemed to blur. The pain in his body was nothing compared to the pain in his soul. The knowledge that, despite a lifetime of integrity and decency, he could still be treated like a criminal because of the color of his skin. And as the police car sped through the streets, Elijah's thoughts turned to his son, Derek. He knew that Derek would come for him, would believe him. But as he sat in the back of the car, feeling utterly alone, he couldn't shake the fear that this nightmare was only beginning. Derek Thompson paced the living room, glancing at his watch for what felt like the 100th time. The small space, decorated with carefully selected mementos and family photos, felt colder than usual tonight. He'd gone all out for his birthday dinner, an intimate celebration with his father, whom he'd looked up to his entire life. But the dinner was long past ready, and his father, Elijah, was nowhere to be found. Elijah wasn't one to be late, especially not for an occasion like this. Derek had called his father's phone several times, each time receiving only silence in return. A gnawing unease had settled in his stomach. Trying to keep his composure, Derek reassured himself with every possible explanation. Maybe traffic was bad, or maybe Elijah had simply misplaced his phone. But no matter how much he tried to rationalize, an instinctive worry clawed at his thoughts. The familiar ringtone interrupted his pacing, and Derek's heart jumped. Snatching his phone from the coffee table, he looked down, expecting to see his father's name on the screen. But instead, he saw a notification from one of his officers at the precinct. The message was simple, yet jarring. "New detainee at Central Station, Elijah Thompson." The words blurred for a moment as Derek stared at the screen, unable to process what he was reading. His father, a man of quiet strength and unshakable integrity, under arrest? How was that even possible? Whatever had happened had to be some kind of mistake, some horrible misunderstanding. Without another second's hesitation, Derek grabbed his jacket and headed out the door, his mind spinning as he tried to piece together what could have led to this. He knew his father wouldn't be in trouble, not unless there was a reason, and even then it wouldn't be anything that warranted arrest. Derek tightened his grip on the steering wheel as he navigated the darkened streets, his mind shifting from confusion to a simmering anger. He understood the system all too well, had seen it misused enough times to recognize how easily people could jump to conclusions, especially when a black man was involved. By the time Derek reached the police station, the calm demeanor he usually wore had been replaced by a cold, focused determination. He stepped inside, his badge prominently displayed on his chest, and headed directly for the front desk. The young officer stationed there looked up, his expression shifting from mild boredom to alarm as he recognized Derek. "Captain Thompson," the officer stammered, clearly caught off guard. Derek was known throughout the precinct as a fair but no-nonsense leader, and from the look in his eyes, tonight was no exception. "Where is he?" Derek's voice was low, but his words carried an unmistakable edge. The officer gulped, his gaze shifting uncomfortably. "Sir, who are you looking for?" "My father, Elijah Thompson," Derek replied, his patience rapidly wearing thin. "He's here, under arrest. I want to know why." A flicker of recognition passed over the officer's face, and he glanced nervously at a nearby colleague. Yes, sir. He was brought in earlier. There was some kind of disturbance at a store." Derek's expression hardened, and he didn't wait for further explanation. Pushing past the desk, he made his way toward the holding area, his stride unyielding. He knew the station like the back of his hand, every corridor and every room, but tonight it felt foreign. The knowledge that his father, a man who had always instilled in him the values of integrity, respect, and dignity, was behind these walls filled him with a combination of anger and disbelief. As he reached the holding area, Derek's eyes quickly scanned the dimly lit cells. There, seated on a metal bench at the end of the corridor, was Elijah. His father looked worn, his usually steady gaze replaced by one of exhaustion and pain. Derek's heart clenched at the sight. "Dad," he called, his voice softening for the first time that night. Elijah looked up, and the flicker of relief in his eyes was unmistakable. "Derek." Ignoring the officer who stood nearby, Derek approached the cell and motioned to the guard to unlock it. The guard hesitated, glancing between Derek and Elijah, clearly unsure how to proceed. "Open the cell," Derek repeated, his tone brooking no argument. The guard scrambled to unlock the door, stepping aside as Derek entered and moved to his father's side. Elijah winced as he stood, leaning on Derek's shoulder for support. His clothes were rumpled, and a faint bruise was forming on his cheek. "What happened?" Derek asked quietly, keeping his voice low as he supported his father's weight. Elijah shook his head slowly, his voice filled with a quiet dignity. "It was a misunderstanding, or maybe something worse. A young man at the store, he said I started something with him." He paused, his voice faltering. "But I didn't, Derek. I was just standing in line." Derek's jaw clenched as he listened, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. He knew his father, knew that Elijah would never instigate a fight, especially not with a stranger. The image of his father, a man he admired and respected more than anyone, being treated like this was almost too much to bear. "We'll talk about it later, Dad," Derek said gently, guiding him out of the cell. "Let's get you home first." As they made their way back through the station, Derek's gaze landed on the officers who had been responsible for Elijah's arrest. Two of them stood nearby, exchanging nervous glances as Derek approached, his father by his side. Derek's anger, carefully controlled until now, rose to the surface. "You two," he said, his voice cold and unyielding. "You brought my father in tonight." The officers shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of the gravity of the situation. One of them, a younger officer with a hesitant expression, cleared his throat. "Yes, sir. There was a disturbance at the store, and—" Derek cut him off, his voice laced with contempt. "Did you even ask for his side of the story? Did you take any time to find out what actually happened, or did you just take his word for it?" He nodded toward Elijah. The officers exchanged a look, clearly unsure of how to respond. "Sir, we were just following protocol," one of them stammered. "The man said he was defending himself and—" Derek's anger flared, and he took a step closer, his voice lowering to a dangerous level. "You believed a stranger over my father without a shred of evidence, without checking for witnesses or even asking him what happened. You threw an innocent man into a cell and walked away. One of the officers opened his mouth to respond, but Derek held up a hand, silencing him. "Save it. You'll have time to explain yourselves later. For now, I want you to think about what it means to have the privilege of wearing that badge." He paused, his gaze hardening, because that privilege might not last much longer. The officers paled, their confidence evaporating in the face of Derek's fury. They understood the implication of his words, knew that they were facing serious consequences for their actions. Derek turned back to his father, placing a protective arm around his shoulder. "Let's go, Dad." As they exited the station and stepped into the night air, Derek felt a deep sense of resolve settle over him. His father had been treated unjustly, humiliated, and thrown into a cell without cause. And though Elijah was free now, Derek knew that the real battle was just beginning. He couldn't let this go, couldn't allow the men responsible for his father's suffering to escape accountability. The drive home was quiet, both men lost in their thoughts. Elijah sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, his hands resting in his lap. Derek's anger simmered beneath the surface, a controlled fury that demanded action. He knew that his father was too dignified to demand justice, but Derek wasn't. He would make sure that everyone involved, the officers, the young man at the store, faced the consequences of their actions. As they arrived at Elijah's home, Derek helped his father inside and guided him to a chair. The dinner that had once seemed so important now felt like a distant memory, overshadowed by the events of the evening. The decorations, the carefully arranged table, all of it seemed irrelevant in the face of what his father had endured. "Rest, Dad," Derek said softly, kneeling beside him. "I'll make sure this doesn't happen again. I'll make sure they pay for what they did to you." Elijah nodded, his expression weary but grateful. He reached out, placing a hand on Derek's shoulder. "Thank you, son. But remember, there's a right way to do things." Derek forced a small smile, though his mind was already racing, formulating a plan. He knew that his father was a man of peace, a man who believed in the power of forgiveness. But tonight, Derek felt no such inclination. His father's words lingered in his mind, but they did little to quell the fire that burned within him. After making sure his father was settled, Derek left the house, his thoughts focused and his determination unwavering. The events of the evening had made one thing clear. He couldn't simply walk away. The system that he'd devoted his life to, the system that was supposed to protect people like his father, had failed. And if the system wouldn't serve justice, he would. As he got into his car, Derek knew what needed to be done. There would be consequences for the officers who had arrested his father without question, and for the man who had attacked him. Derek would make sure of it. Tonight, the system's failure had become personal, and he was determined to make things right. As Derek sat in his car, the weight of his decision settling over him, he knew he couldn't return home until justice had been served. He had always prided himself on following the rules, on being a fair and just officer. But tonight was different. His father had been wronged, humiliated, and he couldn't let those responsible walk away without consequence. First on his list were the officers who had recklessly arrested his father without so much as asking for his side of the story. They had thrown Elijah into a cell based on the word of a man who had no credibility, no evidence, and no respect. And yet, those officers had believed him over an innocent elderly man. Derek's mind raced as he crafted a plan to ensure that their actions wouldn't go unchecked. Early the next morning, Derek arrived at the precinct with a sense of cold determination. The officers who had arrested Elijah were already there, looking uncomfortable and avoiding his gaze. They knew what was coming. Derek had wasted no time filing a formal report and initiating an internal investigation. The chain of command was notified, and the officers had been summoned for a disciplinary hearing. The station's meeting room was silent as Derek entered, his gaze hard as steel. The officers shifted uneasily, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Derek wasted no time in laying out the facts, each word delivered with precision and an undeniable authority. He listed their failures, their negligence, and their utter disregard for due process. The officers looked down, the weight of his words settling over them as the reality of the situation became clear. "You didn't follow protocol," Derek said, his voice even and controlled. "You didn't gather any evidence. You took the word of one man over the other without question, and because of that, an innocent man suffered." One of the officers tried to protest, his voice weak and filled with fear. "Sir, we didn't know. We thought we were doing the right thing." Derek cut him off with a sharp look. "You thought wrong, and now you'll face the consequences." The disciplinary committee, which included Derek's superiors, reviewed the evidence and listened to Derek's account of the events. It didn't take long for them to reach a decision. The officers were suspended, pending further investigation, their careers hanging by a thread. As they left the room, their heads hung low, Derek felt no sympathy. They had failed in their duty, and they deserved to face the consequences of their actions. With the officers dealt with, Derek turned his attention to the man who had started it all, Kyle, the young man who had attacked Elijah in the grocery store. Derek knew that he couldn't rely on the justice system alone to hold Kyle accountable. The courts might be lenient, might see him as a troubled young man rather than a violent aggressor. But Derek wasn't willing to take that chance. Using his connections within the precinct, Derek ensured that Kyle was arrested and charged with assault. He knew that this might be the most he could accomplish within the bounds of the law, but he was determined to make Kyle understand the weight of his actions. The arrest was swift, and Kyle was brought into custody, his cocky demeanor faltering as he realized the gravity of his situation. The cell door clanged shut, and Kyle found himself alone, the cold reality of his predicament settling over him. Derek watched from outside the cell, his gaze steady as he took in the young man who had shown no remorse, no regret for his actions. For a brief moment, Derek considered speaking to him, letting him know the pain he had caused. But he knew that Kyle wouldn't listen, wouldn't understand. Some people only learned the hard way, and Derek was more than willing to ensure that Kyle learned his lesson. Days passed, and Derek kept a close eye on the proceedings. The investigation into the officer's conduct moved forward, and the charges against Kyle were finalized. But despite the official consequences, Derek knew that there was a part of him that still felt unsettled, that wanted a sense of closure beyond what the system could provide. One night, Derek received a call from an old friend, a former officer who had worked in the precinct years ago. This friend knew people who could make things happen in places where the law sometimes fell short. He offered Derek a chance to make sure that Kyle's time in jail would be far from easy, that he would feel the weight of his actions in a way that words could never convey. Derek hesitated, the inner conflict gnawing at him. He had always prided himself on following the law, on being a beacon of integrity. But tonight, he thought about his father, about the pain in Elijah's eyes as he recounted the events in the grocery store. Derek knew that sometimes justice needed a helping hand, a reminder that actions had consequences beyond what the courts could deliver. With a quiet resolve, Derek accepted the offer, knowing that it was a decision he would have to live with. The arrangements were made, and soon Kyle found himself facing a series of accidents in jail that left him shaken and humbled. Derek didn't need to know the details. He trusted his friend to handle it. And though he didn't take pleasure in the thought of Kyle's suffering, he felt a sense of closure, knowing that his father's dignity had been defended in a way that Kyle would never forget. The next morning, as Derek arrived at the station, he received word that Kyle had been moved to a different facility, his spirit broken and his arrogance replaced with fear. Derek felt no pity for him. Kyle had earned every moment of discomfort. But there was a heaviness in Derek's heart, a sense that he had crossed a line that he could never uncross. Returning home, Derek found his father waiting for him, seated in his favorite chair by the window. Elijah looked up as Derek entered, his gaze filled with a quiet understanding. Derek knew that his father had sensed the weight of his actions, the toll that justice had taken on his soul. Sitting beside his father, Derek tried to find the words to explain, to justify what he had done. But Elijah placed a hand on his shoulder, his touch gentle and reassuring. "I know, son," Elijah said softly, his voice filled with a calm wisdom. "You did what you thought was right, but don't let it change who you are." Derek felt a lump form in his throat as he looked into his father's eyes. Elijah had always been a man of peace, a man who believed in the strength of forgiveness. And though Derek had taken a different path, he understood now that his father's words held a deeper truth, a reminder that justice was not always clean, not always free from consequence. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the past days settling over them. Derek knew that he had done what needed to be done, but he also understood that the line between right and wrong had blurred, leaving him in a place that was neither black nor white. As he left his father's side, Derek knew that the events of the past few days would stay with him, a constant reminder of the cost of justice. He had defended his father's honor, had held those responsible to account, but at a price that he alone would carry. In the end, justice had been served. But as Derek walked out into the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something within him had shifted, leaving a mark that would remain long after the memory of Kyle's arrogance and the officer's negligence had faded. As he drove away from his father's home, Derek knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions. But tonight, as he looked back one last time, he felt a quiet resolve, a determination to uphold his father's legacy and protect the dignity of those who could not protect themselves, no matter the cost. This story reminds us that justice isn't always straightforward, and that the fight for what's right can leave lasting scars. Elijah's ordeal and his son Derek's determination show the lengths people go to protect their loved ones and honor. If this story moved you, let us know your thoughts in the comments, hit the like button, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Thank you for watching.